Okay, hello and welcome to today's event. My name is Klára Votavová and I will be today's moderator. As you have probably guessed, the debate will be held in English. However, if you wanted to ask questions in Czech, it's also okay because, of course, Ivan Kalmar understands Czech. I'm very happy to see you here, quite numerous, despite the extraordinarily stormy weather. Which I fear is maybe going to become a reality, but that's another sad topic that we will maybe discuss another time. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Ivan Kalmar, who is a Czech-born anthropologist from the University of Toronto and the author of a new book, White But Not Quite, which also gave the title for today's event. Maybe you can show the book. And equally, I'm very happy to welcome Professor of Political Science here at the Charles University, Mr. Pavel Barša. So today, we are going to discuss a topic that I believe many of us are somehow aware of in our consciousness, but find quite hard to articulate, especially within the polarized Czech political debate. We will talk about racism towards East Europeans as it manifests in the West, but also quite often in our own minds. We will equally talk about how people in our region reproduce this racism further towards the East, but also towards the global South. We are going to talk about the world economic system, whereby the semi-privileged Central Europe plays both the role of the colonizer and the colonized. We are also going to address the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war and how it changed existing perceptions and hierarchies in Europe. Last but not least, we are going to talk about if and how we can fight these ingrained East Europeanist assumptions. The debate will be structured as follows. First, Professor Kalmar will give his introductory lecture of maybe 20 minutes. Then we will have time for reactions from Mr. Barša. Then maybe I will ask a few follow-up questions, and of course we will open the floor to the audience. So I hope you have an inspiring session today, and that you will, that we will find this debate interesting. Thank you for coming. And I give the floor to Ivan.
Thank you very much, Klára, and thank you everybody for coming here and for your interest. Thank you, Ondřej Slačálek, for organizing this and the idea, and Klára for interviewing me earlier and moderating here, and Professor Barša for doing me the honor of debating with me here today. We're going to, as Klára said, speak English, but I do understand Czech. It's just when I speak Czech, it's terrible, so I'm ashamed. And the truth is, I wrote the book in English, I work in English, so it's easier for me to do it in that language. So my work in general, and by the way, I hope you can hear me back there. I see Václav Valach. Please wave at me if you can't hear me. My work falls into the sort of general area of discussion about Central and Eastern Europe, and the kind of literature, both academic and popular and journalistic, that basically addresses two problems. One problem is, why is it that more than 30 years after the Převrat, 1989, we're still talking about East and West, and not just talking about it, it's not just in our minds, but it's also in our hearts. Maybe it's not something totally objective, maybe it's psychological or emotional or affective, but the East-West divide is still there. So why is that the case? And the second issue that so much is written about, and I'm also trying to contribute to it, is so-called democratic backsliding. What is happening in Central and Eastern Europe that, you know, it used to look like liberal democracy would prosper, and it's not prospering. And there's this kind of rhetoric that the area has experienced failure. Oh, so maybe it's hard to hear me after all. Did you hear anything?
It's about stream, not about display.
Oh, for the stream, yes.
So if you could speak closer to microphone, it will be better for people on the stream.
Okay. Yeah, so the explanations that I find are, and I'm sure you do too, that are common in the literature is often rely on ideas about Eastern Europe, that Eastern Europe has a different character, that it has a different culture, and that it's a kind of culture that is not compatible with Western democracy. Okay, so a lot of the literature is about this, like why has democracy failed in Eastern Europe? And the answer is typically sought in something specifically Eastern European. Okay, so in my work, I'm not terribly happy with that because I think that Eastern Europe is a very heterogeneous place, and you cannot generalize from what happens in one place to another. But also, I don't think it's as different from the West as this attitude requires it to be culturally. Okay, so personally, I'm not a fan of ideas about incompatibility between the Eastern European mind or culture and Western democracy. And it's not a complementary view of Eastern Europe either, because generally what's said to be culturally distinctive about Eastern Europe is a kind of backward, dark, reactionary mindset, anti-Semitism, racism, and authoritarianism are supposed to be part of it. So I think that it's not that, you know, there's, as Marshall McLuhan said, there's a lot of truth in a half-truth. So there's probably something to this half-truth that I just mentioned. But I think it's important to look into the role of the West and not just sort of posit this wall between East and West and explain everything in the East as if it was specific to the East. And what I see as responsible for the problems that we have with democracy in Central Europe, because democracy has a problem in Central Europe, but not only in Central Europe. Just look at the elections in France yesterday. But I think that everywhere, what's responsible for the sort of illiberal reaction against democracy is the characteristics of 21st century capitalism. So let me say just a little bit about what I mean by this. I mean that capitalism is a kind of system that depends on the distinction between core areas where capital is accumulated and peripheral areas where people are supposed to be providing cheap labor and be passive consumers for goods that are exported from the core. Okay, so capitalism requires the difference between core and periphery. Capitalism also is not a system of all capitalists together trying to benefit from the economy of the world, but it's a competitive system. Okay, capitalism is about different groups of capital competing with each other. Okay, so it seemed in 1989 perhaps that there was globalization and that the core was the United States and Western Europe. But since then we see that Russian and Chinese capital has stood up. Chinese is more important than Russian, but Russian also stood up to this so that now we have a multipolar world of capital. So when Western capital moved into the former socialist areas, the local people didn't have sufficient capital to resist. Okay, so that the pattern that took place was to locate in the Eastern Europe factories with cheap labor and to export products, new products to Eastern Europe, a pattern that is similar to that of the colonies. Okay. And so I think that this was what was supposed to happen in the, from the perspective of the interests of Western capital. But even though originally there wasn't that much capital in the hands of local people, still some kind of local capital that Agnes Nagy calls national capital did develop. And it developed most strongly in Russia because Russia did not become part of the European Union. So the Russian national capitalists were able to co-opt the Russian state so that it would serve their interests. So what has happened was that it was only Central Europe and not Russia where Western capital was very successful. But also not totally successful because even in Central Europe, national capital developed to defend its interests. And we see here in the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, for example, was deliberately active in creating a Czech bourgeoisie that could be supported by the Czech state. Okay, so I'm saying this in order to explain my bit about racism. Because we call it racial capitalism. It's not, racial capitalism is not a kind of capitalism. It's all capitalism is racial capitalism. So when we say racial capitalism, we're talking about the aspect of capitalism, which is that there are discourses, images, talk, rhetoric that justify the difference between the core of capital accumulation and the other areas of the world where cheap labor and resources are provided. And so many of my colleagues and I consider that racism originated in early capitalism in order to support and justify the restriction of capital accumulation to the colonial centers and denial of Western-style rights to people in the colonies. So that's the racism we're familiar with, is racism against people who happen to be people of color. Okay, so black people especially. And what people might find a little bit disturbing when I say that there's also racism against Eastern Europeans. And often people argue with me, maybe we'll argue today. I'm not sure, the arguments against me, most of them are pretty good. So this one, I think, is particularly weighty. Okay? But what I mean by racism here is that element of racial capitalism where the core, the privileged core, develops, supports, and uses discourses about the lesser qualifications, the inferiority of another population, that they're not qualified to enjoy the same amount of wealth and also the same degree of democracy as these core areas. Okay? So in that sense, I'm talking about racism. Because lately, most scholars don't think of race as a matter of color. Anything could be racialized. Religion could be especially racialized. And I think that in East-West relations in Europe, that Eastern Europeans are racialized in this sense, that there is a lot of talk about Eastern European character which disqualifies Eastern Europeans from actually having a prosperous, progressive capitalist democracy. Okay? And if you're following what I'm saying, I think you will see that this would also apply to a lot of scholars who write books about how Eastern Europeans are not mentally or culturally the same kind of people as Western Europeans, and that explains the so-called failure of democracy in Eastern Europe. Okay, so this racism against Eastern Europeans, I call it Eastern Europeanism. And Eastern Europeanism is also accepted in the hearts of Eastern Europeans myself. I'm a kind of Eastern European, but not quite, since I've spent most of my life in Canada. But I feel something, and when I talk to other people with Central Eastern European roots, they also feel something, that it's a sensitive issue, a touchy issue, and that you're from Eastern Europe. Okay? And like people who are kind of marginalized a bit, Eastern Europeans love to talk about it because they would like to know what they look like to other people so they can explain it to themselves. And Eastern Europeanism is admitted into the minds and hearts, I claim, of Central Europeans especially, because the whole point of Central Europe, well, not the whole point, but one point about Central Europe is that it's not Eastern Europe. Like the Eastern Europeans, they're more Eastern Europeans than we are. Okay? We're more like the West. Right? So there's this gradation, like to East Germans, the Czechs are less Western and more Eastern European, but to Czechs, it's Slovaks. I grew up in Slovakia. For Slovaks, it's Ukrainians, but in Ukraine, for Western Ukrainians, it's Eastern Ukrainians, and ultimately, it's Russians, okay? So now I'm gonna hop back to what I said before, that Western capital wanted to use all of Eastern Europe, but especially Russia, the biggest power, the biggest market, post-communist market, as a source of colonial-like cheap labor and suppliers of raw materials and captive markets for the West. So Eastern Europeanism is really about, ultimately, the rivalry between two imperial powers, Russia and the West. And Central Europe uneasily keeps falling in between these two empires. And generally, Central Europeans would rather feel identified with the West than with Russia, although I think it's a political issue too, and there are differences between right and left and so forth. Okay, so really the Eastern Europeanism as it is practiced from Central Europe is like, we're not Russians. Okay, don't confuse us with Russians. So rather than us being against the prejudices about Russia, we actually have those prejudices about Russia, but we don't feel that it's not fair that we should be considered as part of it. So with the war in Ukraine, of course, this is really changing because Ukraine used to be considered by many people as almost Russia. So it's not just Putin who was thinking that way, I think. Okay? I think many, I admit, I have to include myself there too. It's Eastern Orthodox, a lot of them speak Russian. And we didn't pay enough attention when they were demonstrating in Kiev to Euromaidan to join the European Union. And although Central Europeans supported always the admission of Ukraine into the Western alliances, but the support was not that enthusiastic compared to what it has become now that it's too late. Okay, so I think that Eastern Europeanism is a dangerous doctrine, as we can, or not a doctrine, discourse, And we can see that not only in the reaction, illiberal reaction in Central and Eastern Europe, which I think is a misguided response to this racism against Eastern Europeans, but we also see it in the way that Ukraine has been treated recently. So, yeah, so 30 years later, we're still talking about East and West, and I think it's because of this discourse that serves Western capital. And I believe that illiberalism is in many ways a misguided response to that discourse of Eastern Europeanism that I just described. So
maybe I will begin by saying something about post-colonial studies in this country, which doesn't exist, as you know, certainly. But because I think the book is really the great, it's a great book, by the way. I think we should say that loudly. I was really enthusiastic when I finished it 3 days ago. And even if I was puzzled by some of the claims in the book, but I felt that this is exactly the book we need here in the Czech Republic and maybe in Central Europe more broadly, because when I first encountered the post-colonial discourse or demands that post-colonialism should be used as a perspective in this country as well. I think it was around 2010 or something like that. And there were some of our friends, I think they are not here, none of them is here, our comrades from the group Transit, NGO Transit, who published, since I think 2009, they published a series of books by Fanon, by Homi Bhabha, Anthology from Post-Colonial Studies, 3, 4, 5 books, I think, in their publishing house. And actually, it inspired me to write a book which partly deals with Fanon, because I said to myself, well, now when we have Fanon in Czech, maybe I should write a book in Czech. I try to connect Fanon with Central European thinkers. It didn't, and my comrades from Transit invited me several times to discuss post-colonial perspective, I think in 2011, 2012. And there I realized that it's quite difficult, because one of the first attempts at using this perspective for us was simply to say, we are also in the post-colonial situation because we used to be the colony of Russia or USSR, okay? So now we have basically the same problem. We suffered by Russian or Soviet colonialism, and now we deal with similar questions. I felt that it's not really a good starter, especially because I realized that much of post-colonial stuff is about the civilizational difference, about, you know, the ranking of the West is always high, and colonies are supposed to be low, right? Barbaric or, you know, backward, lagging behind. And here, at least for my generation, the general consensus was exactly reversed, that we are actually occupied by an empire which is from the East, which is a semi-Asiatic empire, which is more backward than we are. So that was a different discourse, different. Ivan has a very nice chapter devoted to Kundera's essay, Tragedy of Central Europe from, I think, 83, and he he analyzes that. I think that essay is one of the instances where, Central European author expresses this idea of Russia as a sort of empire which occupied us, but which is lower on the civilizational scale, right? So it was not really a good start, and I wasn't able. I remember I was trying to, on a panel discussion, some persons, develop this perspective, and I was not really able to connect with that because I felt something is wrong. Then 10 years after that, quite recently, 2-3 years ago, there was just before COVID pandemic, there was an initiative, I think, at the faculty, here at this faculty, that the decolonization, which had a sort of decolonization discourse, we should apply post-colonial perspective here. Now, the thesis was the opposite thesis. The thesis was, when I spoke with some students who initiated that, the thesis was that we should say loudly that we belong to the colonizers, not to colonized, okay? So it was completely opposite. And I felt, again, it was better than the first claim, I think. And you need to read his book to understand why I'm saying that. But still, without any mediation, to simply say, anybody who says that we have a different relation to Western racism and Western colonialism than Brits and French is racist himself, because he denies that we participated in that. And so I rather shyly, I said, well, but, maybe we didn't have any colonies, right? So you are certainly right that we want to belong to the West, but we don't have the direct experience with colonizing other people, especially the people of color. But we have Roma, and it's the same, right? Well, and now I think it begins it starts being interested, because I think this analogy is much better, and we should develop that. But again, my claim would be that this is not the same, right? This is not the same. First of all, because historically speaking, Roma came here on their own. We didn't come to them and colonize them, right? Which doesn't really excuse us if we are racist against them, but I think it's a different experience. So you simply cannot say, well, this is the same thing. So I think maybe I suggested some reason why you should read the book. Because he actually tries to capture some of those things, this ambiguous, ambivalent position of Central Europeans, somewhere between colonizing West and East, which is viewed from the West with the same Orientalist, very often or racist lenses. So maybe I should add. Okay, now I will say several points where I was surprised, for instance, and I will, by some of Ivan's point, and I will be talking not as academic actually, but as a witness, or as a, how do you say pamětník? A witness? Witness, yeah. Because, first of all, I was quite surprised. I live here in this country for 62 years or so. And I must say that I never felt, especially in the last 30 years, I never felt Eastern Europeanism directed against myself. I don't have really this experience. Okay. Well, in the 80s, as a reader of Kundera's essay, I knew exactly what he's speaking about, because at that time, that was the problem. you know, for my generation and of course for Kundera's generation, that we were assimilated in the Western perspective. We were assimilated, and again, Ivan brilliantly describes that, assimilated into the East. So the point was to make a case for Central Europe as a part which is not the East, which Kundera made the case, right? It's not Eastern Europe. Central Europe is different. And of course, the discourse was large. There were various levels of discourse. There was historians like, you know, Such, who made historical analysis where he tried to argue, which is called, I think, the famous essays, Three Europes, where he argues that, historically speaking, especially from the political economic perspective, you can see since the 17th, 16th century, the differentiation of three Europes. There is a political economic argument. I think Such actually already referred to Wallerstein, if I'm not mistaken, but the center of gravity of his argument was nevertheless culture. There was also the reference to you know, difference between Latin Christianity and Orthodox Christianity and so on and so forth. But I think the crucial was the second serfdom as an argument, the second serfdom in Central Europe. In the 17th century, when in the West the constraints on peasants began to loosen, in this region they became stricter and stronger, while in the East itself it was close to slavery, basically, right? So you had a political economic argument, historical argument, on which you have the superstructure, as we Marxists say, superstructure argument, difference in Christianity, and you could see that the argument was rigged in a way which showed, Such argument, which showed that we are actually part of the West, not of the East, on both accounts, right? Political, economic, and religious. So by that time, which was 40 years ago, it was really an urgent issue for our generation to make this point and to make it clear to the Westerners whenever they showed up here, which was not so very often. But in the 90s and 2000s, I think it really loosened. I don't remember, I mean, within Europe at least, maybe because you are from North America, I've never, you know, it was taken for granted, I think. Whenever I was in Paris, in London, in Berlin, that I'm from Central Europe. And this is not Eastern Europe. So I never felt you know, the kind of racism Ivan tries to capture. But I think the qualification, what I just said, should be that maybe this is merely terminological point, because what he means by Eastern Europeanism is exactly the scale, the gradation. So there was something, I think, and there is still something, especially after 2015, 2016, after the Visegrad Group revolt against Brussels, like Central Europeanism. I don't think anybody in Brussels or in Paris, in Berlin, is saying they belong to Russia. They don't say that, and they don't mean that. But what they mean is that Central Europe is not quite, not quite Western Europe, which is why you have those phenomena like such as Kaczynski, Orban, Zeman, and so on and so forth. And you had this Visegrad Group as one bloc which stood up against Brussels and against especially during the refugees policy. So maybe it's simply terminological, because Ivan would probably say that this kind of Central Europeanism is what he means by Eastern Europeanism, because the extreme of the scale is, of course, Russia. Even if they don't mean that, I don't think they would. Really, what I think is that, of course, the scale is there. imagination, the scale is there implicitly, right? They are further to the east, the Central Europeans, and that means that the east is bad, right? So in that sense, maybe it's only terminological problem. Another thing is I also have this problem which Ivan mentioned, and when I wrote that book, when I discussed Fanon and others and tried to somehow link it to the 70s and 80s in this region, in the introduction for that book, I have a long note when I explain that I actually avoid to use the word racism for a nationalistic, xenophobic phenomena and discourses of this region. And I react to a Hungarian guy. There is a small Worstenian school in Budapest, and one of those guys wrote a big book when he made this point that we can actually have this scale of racism, racial stigmatization, which goes from the core to the semi-periphery to the periphery. And you can call all those stigmatization racist stigmatizations. So that means that if the Czech is saying, well, Ukrainians are not quite Europeans, you are already racist. This is a racist statement because you are going on the scale and you are saying Ukrainians are farther to the east, so they are lesser culturally speaking and so forth. I made a point in the note that I think something gets under the carpet, that you then have racism against black people or against Jews, for that matter. It doesn't have to be the color, right? Which is really racism, because and some other more culturally based stigmatization. I must say that reading that book weakened my opposition to that. So I will think about that. But I still think what, even when Ivan explained it just a while ago, I think it would be enough to say Orientalism, or culture racism, because what it means is actually that you essentialize certain aspect of culture of the given society, and you say this society is not so high in cultural civilizational terms as my society. So it's a culture devaluation of the other. Okay, I will not go further because maybe we will come back to that, but this used to be my argument against that. Against using that, I felt that racism is homogenizing different experiences of stigmatization. It also relativizes the evil of anti-black racism and anti-Semitism, because it put everything on the same homogeneous scale. So maybe if you have some prejudices against Ukrainians, it's the same as if you were anti-Semite, which I don't think is the same. So that's my problem with that. But as I said, you have to read the book, because I got quite, my opposition against that got weakened. I think it's enough to provoke you to read the book.
Okay, I would like to thank both the professors for their inspiring interventions. I have some questions lined up for them, but maybe first I would like to ask you if you have anything you would like to ask right now, and if not, then I will. Is there anybody? I don't see anybody. No, okay. Oh, there is. Okay, so just pass the mic over there, please. And or you don't need it? I don't know. Okay. As I said, the questions can be also in Czech.
Hi, I don't speak Czech, so English is fine for me. Thank you for your talk. I have a question for Ivan. I found this really fascinating. I come from the Balkan region, and I think that it's perhaps an even better example of this whole idea of white but not quite than Eastern and Central Europe. But I wanted to ask, I'm really happy that these anti-colonial critiques are really becoming mainstreamed in a way, so it's much easier nowadays to speak of this whole colonial legacy, this colonial power relations, especially in this region finally as well. But I was wondering, what is the role of the nation state in this whole story? I mean, in your argument, because we know that we used to think that neoliberalism would supersede the nation state, but that was, of course, was not the case, right? I mean, the nation state is today stronger than ever, and we still have this very violent world of divided in national borders. And we also know that racial capitalism and the nation state are mutually constitutive, right? And I'm just asking this question because it's kind of become really easier to do this anti-colonial critique, but the critique against the national order of things that is also constitutive in this whole coloniality of the present day is kind of pushed aside. So I was just wondering, in your argument, I mean, does that feature anywhere? Thank you.
Just keep the question. So thank you very much for the question. I haven't really theorized much about the nation state in this context, and perhaps I should, but I mentioned a little bit about Russia versus Central Europe, and I think the reason that Western capital didn't achieve its maximal designs in Russia is because the Russian nation state was co-opted by Russian national capital, and so this is a kind of incredibly tightly meshed system where the state supports its own capital and vice versa, and sometimes the politicians individually are also capitalists. Whereas the Central European nation states, having given up some of their sovereignty to the European Union, and also, you know, ideologically not aiming to retain them in the beginning. Okay, so they were actually more. They were less able to promote the interests of the national bourgeoisie vis-a-vis international capital. So I think always it's what I'm talking about, the core periphery dynamic definitely works through the nation state. But we also have to look at the relationship of the nation states to what we might call empires. And in the case of the Balkans, historically there was another empire, the Ottoman Empire, in the picture. And so in terms of the racist discourses, it's a related but a different form of kind of Orientalist discourse.
Okay, is there some other question from the audience? Yes, in the back.
I was just wondering if anyone is familiar with Philipp Herser's work. He's published a couple of papers. It's a guy at the Academy of Science, Herser, and it's a concept that he refers to as colonial exceptionalism that here is prevalent in the Czech Republic, where, you know, on the one side you are engaging with this claim that there were no colonies, so it's actually not, we don't have any of this bad baggage on our side, and at the same time, of course, you want to be part of this modern Central, Western, or even Western Europe, and it's he really, I think, captures quite well this ambiguity of the space where, on the one hand, you're not taking responsibility for the fact that your whiteness has had privileges in the past, but on the other hand, you really are, wanting to still live these privileges in one way. So I just, if you're not familiar with this work, a couple of papers that he's published, I found it personally very valuable.
So that was maybe rather a comment. Yeah, but thank you for the recommendation. Maybe I will ask a question now. First, to Professor Kalmar, I would like to ask a question that I haven't asked in our interview, which is coming from a liberal standpoint. Shouldn't we give the West some credit for, I would say, civilizing our region, bringing some progressive values here? Now, for instance, we can talk about environmentalism, we can talk about, the Green Deal, and if this would, consciousness that we actually have to change something in terms of our industry, for instance, would even occur here if we weren't somehow, pushed by the West.
Now it's on, yeah. So, well, if I understand you right, it's didn't the West bring some good ideas to the East? Yeah, I think I don't doubt it for a moment, but so I'm not saying that the West is bad guys and Western idea. Again, my feeling is it's not necessarily a good idea to talk about Western versus Eastern ideas. The idea of environmentalism, I mean, is that a Western idea? I don't know enough about the history of it. But certainly it was a big deal after 1989, I think. It was talked about much more in this area with the coal mines and so forth, which was probably a very good idea. It's not a culturally alien idea to Eastern Europe. It just historically perhaps came from the West. So yeah, I think many very good things came in here from the West. To qualify that, just to be maybe slightly controversial, though it's often the case that these very good ideas from the West, which I wholeheartedly support, often progressive liberal ideas, they're presented as if they were resented in the East but uncontroversial in the West. So the East is kind of a backward area where, for example, many people don't believe in environmental issues. But really, there's tons of people like that in the United States, and there are many people like that in Western Europe. So I think when we think of those as Western ideas, perhaps they are historically, but they are not in any logical way Western ideas, nor is the opposition to them limited to the East. And the same goes with human rights, LGBT rights, women's rights. It's often talked about as if they were Western ideas that are foreign to Central and Eastern Europe, and I don't think that they are, or even that they ever were.
I would also like to ask Mr. Barša maybe to talk a bit more about the Czech political discourse, or maybe how, this proverbial "we belong into the West" somehow embodies maybe this East Europeanism, or if the local elites indeed do not want to address this issue because it's very uncomfortable to them and maybe would strip them of some privileges, or if you have any comments on this.
I
I don't know if I got it. What supposed discourses, or what the discourse is supposed to say, that we don't belong to the West, or we do belong to the West?
No, I think it's like very common in this, like, especially right-wing liberal circles, that, you know, we say like we belong into the West, but we don't want to address maybe like ways in which we either don't, or we are somehow not being treated fairly or anything like that. And, you know, if you can, we talk about it.
No, I think it's, again, Ivan is describing that quite well. I think he's well capturing in the book the ambiguity within the illiberal discourse, that some people don't realize that there is this pro-Western aspect of Orbán's discourse or Kaczynski's discourse. And usually, I mean, in the Czech, if I apply to the Czech situation, it's in the Czech discourse, liberals tend to describe Orbán, for instance, as somebody anti-Western, right? And they don't really realize that he's claiming he wants to be the avant-garde of the West. He's not saying I don't belong to the West. He's simply criticizing Western liberalism, right? That's not the idea of the West, right? So, while in the Czech Republic, for instance, our Speaker of the Parliament would say, I hope, before the last Hungarian parliamentary election, I hope Hungary will take a step towards West, right? The Speaker of our Parliament. Meaning that Hungary will vote out, Orbán out of the power. So it will return to the West. But Orbán's discourse, or Kaczynski's discourse, is we are the avant-garde of the West. West is declining because of this suicidal liberalism, right? Suicidal liberal multiculturalism, and we will save the West. So, but what is a little bit, I think, missing in the book is to apply it for the liberal discourses in Central Europe as well. Because you have for instance, in the Czech context, you have this civilizational discourse of the liberals. And in Poland, I think it's the same, basically. They are saying, Kaczynski is pulling us towards the East, and we should return to the West. And this is Tusk who is saying that, or other people. And here it's the same, basically. They are saying Babiš or Zeman are pulling us towards East, but we should choose the West, right? So they are using the same kind of, they claim their Western belonging, right? In the same way, and the ideological struggle is around that. Who is actually Western? Who is more Western? So this is, I think, the dialectic, that the liberals are having the same kind of, very similar kind of politics of identity in Central Europe. They would, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Pavel. That's really important stuff that you mentioned there. And so I just add to it that there's an ambiguity in the image of Central and Eastern Europe, both in the West. I'm focusing now more on the West, I guess. Liberal and progressive people actually tend to be the ones who uncritically often describe the entire region of Central Europe as given to backward, racist, anti-Semitic, illiberal impulses, while the right-wing nationalists, whatever you want to call them, illiberal people in the West, actually for them, Eastern Europe and especially Russia, but also Hungary, are an example. Okay, this is the way that we want the West to be, and it's best described as white supremacy, really. We want white patriarchal supremacy. We want the white man to be central in what they consider the traditional way to the construction of national and civilizational identity in the West. And that's the discourse, I think, that Orban follows. You know, he has a great audience in the West, Orban, and they don't think that he's anti-Western. They're with him on it, that he's anti-liberal. Okay, now the second fantastic point that you mentioned is that there is an internal kind of civilization, mission civilisatrice attitude by the mainly, I don't know how to describe it, but perhaps the intellectual or educated elites of Central Europe, but also in this case, I would say Russia, some of them, you know, towards the ordinary, uneducated people. They're not Western enough. So there's work by Alexander Etkind, a Russian scholar, who I talked to him recently, and to me, what he's saying is that there's actually racism in Russia by the educated upper classes or elites towards the ordinary Russian peasant people, and that it's historically rooted, like that's a different kind of people. So although I hate to make parallels between Russia and Central Europe, but I think in this case it might make sense that the sort of more pro-Western groups condemn as backward and not Western enough people, and it's not only on the basis of ideology, but also on the basis of social class or urban versus rural residents and things like that.
Maybe I will add only that I think what's a little bit, what's important is also to stress the different, how would I say, the different profile of what we mean by liberal forces or progressive forces in the West and here. Because here actually those who are opposed to Kaczynski or Orban or Zeman are not liberal progressives. Yes, liberal progressives are opposed to them as well, right? But you cannot call Karl Schwarzenberg progressive. He's liberal conservative. You cannot call Donald Tusk progressive. He's liberal conservative. Those are people who are still maintaining liberal conservative consensus of the early 90s, right? But of course, within that polarization, they were put into the position of defenders of Western liberalism, but this kind of Western liberalism has a different profile than when you say, coming from Canada, from North America, liberalism or liberal progressive. It means really something different from, you know, when we say, okay, Tusk or Schwarzenberg are liberal opponents of national conservatives like Dominik Duka or like Miloš Zeman or Orban. So this is the terms have different I think connotations a little bit here, which makes the translation of the perspective more tricky.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from the audience? Okay, so maybe there on the left, Mr. Himmel.
Hello, my name is Pavel Himmel. I would like to turn our attention to our practices. I didn't read a book, unfortunately, but I thought and wrote a bit about this everlasting catching up, for example, in the science and the historiography. This eternal promise, you will catch up, you will cope with the Western historiography, and it didn't happen. And my question would be, did you or do you think also about our practices, how we are reproducing or producing this Eastern Europeanism, for example, by submitting our articles to the Western journals, by applying for the jobs in the Western? Pavel Barša said, he didn't encounter this sort of East Europeanism. But when you apply in the West, and when you really try to compete with our colleague in the West for the same job, you will feel it, you will encounter it, I think. And the other side, how do we, for example, are applying for the jobs in the East, or are we submitting our articles to the journals in the East? So this is, for me, we are part of it. Of course, we are still, I would say, as a scholar, somehow attracted, but it's also stimulated by politics of founding and evaluating on, so really, and we are forced now somehow really to orientate ourselves to the West in our scientific, let's say, practice.
I agree. We are living in the age of global Anglo-American academic hegemony. So basically, and the official policy in this country is exactly this, Ivan. That basically this is you have to publish in Anglo-American academic journal, otherwise you are lost, right? So that's how is that set objectively. So we are put into the position that we are, by definition, on the periphery of the global academic world. The center is Anglo-American academia. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, because I actually was going to say the same thing to Pavel when he said that he doesn't experience racism against Eastern Europeans, that I know what a problem academics have, for example. And I just came from a meeting where somebody was doing a paper on this, showing that among people published in Western top journals, Eastern Europeans as a group were the least successful. Even people from Africa were more successful. I don't think it's good data, to be honest. Maybe, like we discussed the data. I mean, it's a good ideas and it's interesting data, but that particular set of data I wouldn't swear on, but it did show a general reality that people talk about. And as Pavel pointed out, in Central Europe, people get rewarded for publishing in Western journals. A friend of mine in Krakow published something in a journal, a special issue. Ondřej also had a piece there, and he really wanted me to make sure that we publish it by the end of the year, because then he would get special points for publishing in a Western journal and would not have to teach a course, you know. So, you know, I mean, it's true, it's not only Eastern Europe, and to me it's very important, very, very important, and I didn't have time to talk about this, but in the book it's very important that Eastern Europe is only one periphery of racial capitalism. So similar experiences people have in Spain, and I just spent several months in Andalusia, okay, and my colleague there says, Ivan, you know, because our university, you know, no merit of mine, but is highly rated in international rankings. So if he comes to join me as a visiting professor in the University of Toronto, the Spanish government will give him money to like hang out for several months. You know, he couldn't do that Ukraine or Poland or Brno. I don't think he really has to go to one of these highly ranked places. Now, how do these places get so highly ranked? You know, I love my university, I don't want to put it down, but I meet brilliant people like in the Czech Republic, in Spain, in many places. Those rankings are based on reputation. You know, I got asked 2 or 3 times to be one of the people that they ask, you know, what do you think about this place? What do you think about that place? It's all like impressionistic ideas, and Eastern Europeanism is a form of racism that's very subtle. Okay, and we don't talk about it. So people make this judgment like it couldn't be good because it's in Eastern Europe, but they don't make it explicitly In fact, they don't even realize that they're making it, but they are making it. And just to get back to, once I was editing a special issue, and every single paper from Eastern Europe was rejected by the editor. I'm talking to the editor, do you realize what you've done? Because she did not realize it. A very nice person, a wonderful person. She had no idea. I said, look, you rejected every paper from Eastern Europe. And she says, Ivan, I'm going to have a look at it again. So she read the papers again and said, oh yeah, there's lots of wonderful papers here. So let's publish them. So I think that, this is not different from what professionals might encounter outside of academia if they wanted to compete with the West. Or it's not different, I think, from what EU politicians, bureaucrats, civil servants encounter when they compete for jobs in Brussels. Yeah.
I will just have a remark for that last thing that you said. I remember that, when you want to compete for the stagiaire positions in the European Commission, by an account of my friend, you get more points if you apply from a Western European university. You get more points, yeah. Yeah, probably. Do you have any comments on academia?
But I was talking recently with the French scholars, and they have the same problem. So maybe that's Europeanism, even not even Eastern Europeanism, because you have to. In the Czech Republic, it's clear. If you publish something in German or in French, it's not enough. It has to be in American or British academic journal. So it's bigger than that. It's not only about Eastern Europe. It's simply the status of American academia, which is very high. I don't know about Canada, actually, but American academia, this is really the center. So you have to publish there. Even the French people are in the same situation.
Okay, some more questions. I remember there were some. Oh, there's a lot of them. Okay, to diversify, we're going to have a girl, so Monica in the red, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so I will start maybe with a personal note. Unfortunately, I have not read your book, but I just put it to my list of books I want to read. So I'm Slovak, and I just wanted to say that I lived for a bit in London, but also in Brussels, where I was in the EU institutions. And I experienced it, and I also saw how few Eastern Europeans were among the civil servants, because the entry conditions are quite difficult. And when I compared what my university here and the university of my boyfriend in Germany or in London did, like they did preparation courses, so that the conditions were completely, in the starting line was completely different for different nations. But also as a Slovak, I can sometimes feel the racism which you described here. But I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion about the European Union? Do you consider it as an obstacle dividing West and East, or do you consider it as a platform which could unite this basically, West and the East?
Maybe you have to be a Canadian to be a really enthusiastic supporter of the European Union and to be like a passionate European, because I look at myself, I consider myself that way. I was so happy when the Czech Republic joined the European Union. I thought, this is like, if my father was alive, he would be like elated that this could happen. And I consider the European Union, you can criticize it, of course. You can say it's a bastion against the rest of, like it limits itself out against the rest of the world, and it fosters colonial heritage. There's all kinds of criticisms of it, but basically it's sure it does have potential, doesn't it, for uniting people? That was the whole idea. And it's a terrible shame that people don't sometimes see it. You know, I say to my wife, like, Europeans, you don't know what a good thing you have. I mean, it's, you know, no borders, like people speaking different languages, no borders, and you know, at the same time, of course, it discriminates against the East. The very structures of the EU often discriminate against the East, also the way that you have described it. And it's disappointing that some of the leadership of the EU does tend to think of East-West in East-West terms. That, you know, what do we do to make the Easterners happy? Whereas in fact, it's not always the case that Eastern European states have the same interests or act the same way in the EU.
Yeah, I also think it's very valuable that we have this nuanced position and that we can appreciate, you know, that the EU brings us many positive aspects while being able to criticize it, which I think is a very like confident position, you know, like rather than to just like say the problems don't exist, but it's like in every relationship you have to talk about the problems. Okay, some more questions. I remember there was somebody on the left, so yeah, Mr. In the front.
Thank you for both talks that were very interesting. I have just a very simple question concerning the Ukrainian conflict, you know. How would you use your notion of East Europeanism to explain the shifts in discourses and public consciousnesses in, well, whatever countries of Eastern Europe or wherever you look at, right? I mean, because there are clearly some shifts. Even Pavel actually wrote an article about that, right, in a Czech newspaper. So how would you conceptualize the changes that we are witnessing right now? I mean, you know, who belongs, about the idea about who belongs to the West and who doesn't, in terms of East Europeanism? You know, that would be my question. And maybe just a small critical comment, you know, you don't need to react to, that would be both to Pavel and to Ivan, yeah? Maybe the critical comment only to Ivan. So you have the prestigious position here. Because, you know, when I studied in America, in the United States, as I should say, I've often noticed that actually differences that are just economic or socio-economic are often racialized in order to be understood by the public discourse. I'm not speaking about academia, right? I'm speaking, you know, media, just the public discourses. So, you know, the hurricane, Catherine or Katerina, how it was called, and, you know, where it hit whom. It was a clearly class issues. Yet in America, it was terminologically captured by racial discourses only. You know, so I often saw that, and this is something very American. It's not that much a European thing. That in order to describe economic differences, you have to racialize them to make them actually more understandable. You know, that's just the power of the mainstream discourse in America, at least at the time when I studied there. So, and my little provocative question to you, Ivan, would be, if you try to racialize the really existing economic differences between some parts of Europe, let's say, and, you know, whatever, I mean, there is a scale, right? Western Europeans have a different living standard than we do, and we have a different one from Ukrainians, let's say. So why to racialize it, you know? Coming back actually even to Pavel's question, you know, is it a way to make your Eastern European original frustration more understandable to your Canadian and American colleagues? You know, that would be my provocation. Thanks.
Okay, so your comment has a unity to it because it starts with talking about how they put race in America where race doesn't belong, and then you're saying I put race where race doesn't belong. I welcome, I think about it myself. Okay, so let me start with the American situation. Okay, and what is race? Okay, because race is not a matter of someone looking different, and people always hate people who are different. So racism is against those who are different. That's not what it's something much more specific than that. Okay, and race is intersectional. Okay, it always intersects with class and gender and so forth. But especially in a place like New Orleans, and in the case of Katrina, of course working class people were hit harder. But the fact that those working class people were black is not a coincidence, because white supremacy is a system that's ingrained in society, and it doesn't give those that are not part of the system the same opportunities to advance themselves on the social scale. So the fact that African Americans may be certainly in some places disproportionately poor is not a coincidence. I mean, it's not just class. It's class and race. And similarly, when I talk about race, it's not that I want to, okay, let me be self-critical. Am I doing it so that it will be more understandable? I think it's going to be less understandable. It's not understandable very well to people how you can racialize white people, because the popular concept both in North America and in Europe is that race is mainly about color. Okay. So why am I saying race? And I'm saying race because of racial capitalism, because I believe that the attitudes towards Eastern Europeans are generated by this insistence on maintaining a difference between a privileged West and not so privileged East. So that is also the mechanism that creates racism in the colonies. Okay. So what I'm saying is that racial capitalism is like a machine that generates discriminatory discourses. And I call those discourses racism when they're against Africans in the colonies or migrants from Africa to the West. And I include among those discriminatory discourses, discourse about people who are in Eastern Europe or moved to the West from Eastern Europe. So I feel justified in putting those things together. I do have some hesitancy along the lines of what Pavel mentioned, that it may seem that I'm saying that racism against Eastern Europeans is just as bad as racism against black people and people of color or indigenous people or the Roma. Okay, and it really worries me that I might be taken to say that, which is the exact opposite of what I want to say. Because you have different degrees of racism, just like different degrees of any crime or anything that's bad. Okay? It's a crime if you steal a loaf of bread, and it's a crime if you murder someone. If you call stealing a loaf of bread a crime, you're not equating it with murder. And I do not want to equate Eastern Europeanism in any way in its intensity to racism based on color, but only to point out that racial capitalism generates both. So I'm looking for a solution, like maybe after this book I should invent another term that will have racism in it. I'm thinking semi-racism. So it's still a racism, but it doesn't go, as far as other kinds of racism. But I do think that it's not just a matter of class, either in the case of Katrina or in the case of Eastern Europe. Ukraine. Maybe, so this is where Pavel, I haven't read the article, but Ondřej told me that he and Pavel were thinking about this, and maybe you could tell people about it, but because I thought it was really smart, and I totally agree with it.
So just to summarize, I remember like in our interview, you said that the Ukrainian crisis is like an opportunity for our region to shine, but that this opportunity maybe is not going to last because there is this like material reason why we are not able to shine for such a long time. But indeed, this is something that I think Pavel would disagree, or that he says that like there is a basis for something more long-lasting. So if you can elaborate on it.
Basically what I said, and it overlaps with what Ivan says in the book, because Ivan says in the book, he takes the Visegrad group as Central Europe at small, basically. It's a minimalist geographical incarnation of the idea of Central Europe. And I'm saying on the ruins of Visegrad group, I mean, in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, of course, the big split happened between Orban and all the rest of Europe, but also between Orban and the rest of Visegrad group, which basically means that the group stopped functioning, stopped working, right? Because it's not, the gap is not bridgeable. So Visegrad group doesn't exist anymore. So we now have this hindsight, basically. We can see the beginning and the end. Beginning 2015-16, right? The end February 2022. And my thesis was on the ruins of the Visegrad group. The new Central Europe is emerging, much larger, including Ukraine, led by Poland. Poland will realize the dream of Józef Pilsudski from the spring 1919. Where Pilsudski actually made an agreement with Petlura, promised him the small Cossack state in the east of Ukraine, and tried to capture at the last moment, right? Basically against the Parisian treaties. Try to capture Ukraine and basically to renew the Ukrainian-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even if by that time it was clear that Vilnius and Lithuania is lost, but it was taken as temporary, okay? Sooner or later, Lithuania would join. So that there was a dream of restoring the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and I think what you see now, if you follow the discourses of the Polish politicians, they tried to reenact that dream, which means that, and for the time being, Czechs are perfectly cooperative because they are, the ODS is in one club in the European Parliament with PiS. There is no problem at all. National Conservative Party, partly liberal, but it has national conservative wing. Slovakia, I think it's more complex because Slovakian society is split, it seems, and so it really depends who will lead the next government. Hungary is split as well, but Orban proved that he has majority with his position, which is more neutralist position. So the shift of Central Europe. And what's interesting is that Ivan mentioned in the book the thing which I didn't know, actually, that when he has the chapter about the Central European idea, is the chapter about the aftermath of the World War I, where there were two concepts of Central Europe. He mentions the speech by Masaryk in some Central European Society in Philadelphia or something, right, in America, where Masaryk was outlining his vision of Central Europe, where Czechoslovakia was in the center, and it basically encompassed more the Balkans, right? But also Lithuania. And then there was the Polish, the Polish idea of Central Europe, inter marum, between the Baltic and Adriatic Sea. So it reminded me of that what Orban tried to do, he was quite expansive in all directions, that's true, right? He wanted really to have, allies in France, whenever it was possible, Salvini and so on and so forth. But he also had some following in the Balkans. I think there was this idea, Hungary, the Kingdom of Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, the Balkans. So that's this vision of Central Europe, which has this this Balkan reach, is now, I think, superseded by Polish vision, which is more northeastern. Northeastern Central Europe. So, okay, this is the hypothesis, of course. This is the ideas. But I think those are ideas of Polish politicians. You can read it from the discourses, but of course what happens is different. But what's sure, I think, by now is that the Ukrainian war helped Poland to get rid of the stigma. Suddenly, the center of Europe is more or less stigmatized. I mean, Paris and Berlin, because they didn't see it coming. Poles did see it coming. Maybe for completely wrong reasons, as we know, because Kaczynski is basically a conspirationalist guy, and he thought that, his brother was killed by the Russians, so the Russians were, so it was completely delusional reasons, but they saw it coming. Macron or Scholz or Merkel, for that matter, didn't see. So now they are stigmatized. But Poles are the avant-garde. I mean, they realized Orban's dream. Now they lead Europe against Russia. So that's the situation now. I think it will get balanced within several months, I think, because I think the opposition to the war will increase in Central Europe and in Western Europe to the degree that cost of living will rise and all this. So the critics of the war and the critics of this radical position, which is expressed by Central Europeans, will grow more important. So it will lessen, I think, the Polish stature. But by now, I think they are really the leaders of Europe. From the pariah of Europe, within one night, they became the leader.
As evidenced also during their journey to Kiev as the first one when they were named the leaders of Europe. Maybe just a little follow-up question. Do you think there is like an economic basis for this independent Central Europe? Because I think that the system that Ivan is describing is also like very economic. It's like these centers, peripheries. So do you believe that maybe Poland could be a core country in some way to like retain this status?
I don't know economically, but politically speaking, once the European Union will say that the Poles will be the protectors of Ukrainians. So you will have 40 million, people. As that will be a sort of protectorate. Poles will speak for Ukrainians in the next years. So they will have, their weight will be still big, I think. Even if the original, I think there will come sometime within, 6 months or so that this radical posture will be criticized, I suppose. By now it's not the case anymore, but still, even after 1 year, and we will see what happens by the end of the week, because it's clear that Ukraine will be accepted as a candidate of the EU, but the split will be over the time, of course. Because Ukrainians and Poles think that it will be a matter of 2-3 years. While in Paris or in Berlin, they say, well, forget about that. It's like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. That will be the split, not the candidate status, because Turkey is candidate as well, so nobody cares. Candidate status doesn't mean much.
Just very quickly that Macron actually did say that it will take decades for Poland to be in the EU. And I do think that, Poland may be celebrated. Like in Canada, the Poles are now, according to some opinion poll, the second most popular people. I forget who the first is, but the Poles are second. And, excuse me, my Polish friends, but in North America, the jokes that in other countries are about Belgians in Western Europe, or in Canada it's about Newfoundlanders, but in the US it's about Poles, so they don't traditionally have like an admirable position in this kind of racist humor. But at the moment, Poland, I totally agree, is rising high. Economically, Poland is doing relatively well, so they can strengthen their position. The Polish national capital is being protected by Kaczynski, and they nationalized the banks and so forth. So they're really pushing for Poland to be an important member of the European Union. But what I was saying to Klára in the interview personally, and I think Pavel sounds like he might agree with me on this too. I'm not sure that this is going to last a very long time. This is just a kind of heroic status with the war. But I think what's very interesting too is that I did some research on this, and there were 40,000 hate crimes reported against Ukrainians in Poland in a 2-year period. I forget what it was, maybe 2018 to 2020. And so in Poland itself, it's now really changed, because I saw today in Gazeta Wyborcza is saying a headline about how all Poles support Ukraine, and it's a matter of national pride in Poland itself. But in reality, there have been some problems, I think, that will show themselves in the future between Poles and Ukrainian migrants also.
Yeah, I think we are nearing the end. This debate was supposed to last between an hour and a half and 2 hours, so I want to stop somewhere in the middle. Anyways, is there some maybe 1-2 last questions? Yeah, I see Mr. over there, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the lecture. I just gonna follow up on the things you said about that illiberal Eastern Europe, states are misguided reaction to the East Europeanism. My question today would be what's the alternative, political alternative response to the Eastern Europeanism in Central Europe? Because I don't think it's formulated. And I think it's something what also Professor Barša spoke about, that we always have these, not in Czech Republic exactly, but for example in Hungary, when they said we are the new West, the illiberal, Orbán will say we are the new West, we will save the old West from the dying out. And the only alternative from the opposition is, for example, that we need to go back to the West, we need to follow the West. So basically, the only alternative I see right now is basically following the same pattern, that we will prove that we are almost as West as the West, basically. So, and do you see any political alternative to that? Because honestly, I don't see. And me myself, frankly, I also am caught sometimes that I need to choose between using the East Europeanism on convincing my American friends that we are not as East as, for example, Slovaks or Ukrainians. Because honestly, me personally, I don't see the other response as well. So my question to you is there any alternative how to actually solve this problem?
Well, I wish, that I knew more, but I think we have a crisis in the whole world. We saw it in the French election yesterday, and political solutions we don't have good ones. I wish that I could say it differently. And the tragedy, I think, is that the illiberal right, they don't even promise that much. Like, their biggest strength is that they tell it like it is. You know, they're not politically correct, and, you know, they sock it to every kind of foreigner or person who acts differently from them. Although, to be fair, they also have a little bit of welfare policies sort of carefully directed at certain groups of people. But the voters for the right, I think they don't really expect a very great change in society. They just want to be more respected. Whereas the left is always proposing solutions, that it will be better. You know, this is the right solution. And then when they get elected, it doesn't happen, and the things don't get better, because the problems that we face are enormous. I mean, so you're asking me a question. I'm not qualified to say what a good solution is, but what I would like to call attention to is that illiberalism is fueled by Western racism or negativism or whatever you want to call it towards Eastern Europeans, and I don't have any doubt that a lot of the nationalism, racism, which is so sadly very real, let's say in Hungary, is also a matter of spite. You know, we're not going to do it the way that you're telling us we should be doing it. So I would say one solution might be simply a better understanding of where people in Central Eastern Europe really stand vis-a-vis the West.
Okay, and one final question, if there is anyone. Okay, it looked previously that there was somebody, but if not, then okay, yes, go on.
Sorry, can I still ask a question? Yeah, I made a comment earlier on. I wondered, because on the poster we had a picture of Kudela, right, on the announcement, and I just wanted to maybe ask if the scholars both could engage very briefly with this issue, where let's say the West believed that Czechs are racist, maybe less so because of the racial slur that probably Kudela said, but more because of the reaction from the official side in the Czech Republic, right? So, and maybe this could actually feed into the idea of in how far maybe there's also sometimes this, let's say, resistance against the West, or whatever the West believes would be now politically correct or would be supposed to be done, for example, kneeling in sports event, and in how far that further feeds actually and further, you know, steers this kind of Eastern European racism. Thank you. Thank you.
Is going to be happy to get this question, because he was talking about kneeling and what it signifies in different cultures before we started.
Thank you very much. I really did want to talk about this question. And in my book, it's the last chapter is Slavia Praha versus Glasgow Rangers. But before I get into it, I should mention that I had a really interesting conversation with Ondřej Slačálek about the kneeling gesture. Okay? And then I realized what I'm writing about, I was missing something, because I talked about, for example, how Zeman said, like, we're not going to kneel in front of UEFA. That a lot of people, it seems to me, in this region think that the kneeling means that we're sorry. It's like contrition, like, forgive us, black people, that we were racist. And then the answer to that is like, no, we were not racist because we didn't have colonies. Okay, I'm not a fan of this we didn't have colonies idea, but we don't have time to talk about it, so maybe I leave that aside, because I think that colonies were not just a matter of states ruling peoples, but a matter of Europe ruling peoples, and everyone in Europe benefited from it, although to a different extent, but never mind. But the kneeling gesture is not to say that I'm sorry. The kneeling gesture is because Colin Kaepernick, an American football player, knelt during the national anthem of the United States to symbolize the humiliation that African Americans had experienced. So it was a black man, a black athlete who started the kneeling gesture. And then other black athletes with their white friends fostered this in soccer football in Europe. Okay, and so to kneel doesn't mean forgive me because I'm a racist, as much as I sympathize and empathize with the suffering of African Americans who are humiliated by racism. So then, looked at from that perspective, if some Czech or Hungarian or Pole says, I will not kneel, but instead I'm going to point at my sleeve where it says respect, what it really means is I don't empathize with you. I don't empathize with your suffering. I'm against racism in principle, but I'm not sympathizing with the real biggest victims of racism. And to me this seemed very clear, but now I realize that it's a misunderstanding. Like it's not, it's the stimulus for the kneeling is a black man kneeling, not a white man kneeling saying that he's sorry. Okay, so, yeah, now I forget what the original question was, but I just thought that that was really interesting.
If you could, maybe elaborate on like how this entire Kudela affair, affected these discourses of East Europeanism and how it, yeah.
Yeah, so at the same time, so much as I think it's like horrible that teams from Central Europe didn't want to kneel, and maybe they misunderstood, even then it's still horrible, I think. But at the same time, the kind of thing that Kudela did, for which he got a 10 games suspension, in my book I tell you exactly, almost at the same time, what happened in a game played by the Spanish team, I think of Cayenne or Cadiz, and Marseille Olympique. The same. Somebody whispered a racist remark in a black man's ear. And not only did they not get suspended for 10 games, there actually wasn't any punishment. And there certainly wasn't any talk about Western European football racism. At the same time, there was in Britain talk, I mean literally the same time, the British government had to react to the amount of football racism in Britain. So you had on the one hand, terrible football racism in the West, and on the other hand, these articles in the British press about Eastern European football racism. I mention in the book one example where a British journalist was giving examples of racism in Russian football to explain why Czech footballers are racist, because they're all Eastern Europeans. And he said explicitly that this incident was an incident having to do with Eastern European racism. Okay, and I think that's an example of uselessly and not constructively overgeneralizing the same kind of racism that we also see in the West to only Eastern Europeans.
Okay, so if you have nothing to add on this football question, then I would like to thank everybody for their participation, to Mr. Ivan Kalmar, to Mr. Pavel Barša, to the audience. And I hope you learned something interesting or thought-provoking. If you would like to learn more about this issue of East Europeanism, I either recommend the White but Not Quite book, or at least you can read the interview I had with Ivan some 2 weeks ago, published at Alarm. And with this, I would like to thank you again and wish you a nice evening. Goodbye.